February 2nd, 1945, 14:27 hours. In the frozen wasteland of Hürtgen Forest, Corporal Nathan Cross lay motionless behind a fallen oak tree, eye pressed to the scope of his Springfield M1903A4 sniper rifle. He'd been in this position for 3 hours without moving, watching a German medic work near an artillery position 400 yards downslope. The medic wore a white armband with a red cross, clearly visible even through the scope. Geneva Convention protected, untouchable, off-limits to every soldier in every army that claimed to follow the rules of war. But Nathan's finger rested on the trigger anyway, because the man he was watching hadn't treated a single wounded soldier in 72 hours of observation. Instead, the medic spent his time near German artillery positions, always with a radio, always scanning American lines through binoculars. And 20 minutes ago, Nathan had watched him speak into that radio just before German 88mm shells bracketed an American patrol with impossible accuracy. The crosshairs centered on the Red Cross armband. Nathan's breathing slowed. His heart rate dropped. Everything his father had taught him about hunting Montana elk came down to this moment. The stillness before the kill. The absolute certainty required before taking a life. Except elk didn't wear Red Cross armbands. Elk weren't protected by international law. And if Nathan was wrong about what he suspected, if he pulled this trigger based on instinct instead of proof, he wouldn't just be a sniper. He'd be a war criminal. 3 seconds to decide. Respect the Red Cross and let the man live, possibly directing more artillery that would kill Americans, or take the shot that would save lives and destroy his own. Nathan squeezed the trigger. This is the story of the single bullet that killed a German medic, saved hundreds of American lives, and earned one sniper 15 years in military prison for murder. A bullet fired on suspicion that turned out to be justified 30 years too late to matter. Before we go further, if you believe some war crimes are only crimes until you learn the whole truth, hit that subscribe button, because this is the story they buried in classified files until everyone involved was already dead. The Hürtgen Forest in February 1945 was a frozen hell that had been consuming American lives since September. 70 square miles of dense woodland along the German-Belgian border, fortified by Wehrmacht forces who'd had years to prepare defensive positions. Americans called it the meat grinder. Soldiers who went in rarely came out unchanged. Many didn't come out at all. Nathan Cross had arrived in Hürtgen on January 28th with the 78th Infantry Division, assigned as a sniper to provide overwatch during the division's push toward German positions. He was 24 years old, from Missoula, Montana, the son of an elk hunting guide who'd taught him to shoot before he could read. The Army had trained him at sniper school, refined his natural talent, and given him a scope-mounted Springfield rifle with the expectation that he'd use it to kill German officers, machine gunners, and anyone else who presented a legitimate military target. The training had been specific about what didn't qualify as legitimate: medics, chaplains, prisoners, wounded enemy soldiers attempting to surrender. The Geneva Convention protected these categories absolutely. Shooting them wasn't combat, it was murder. Nathan had understood this, had agreed with it, had spent 4 months in Europe carefully identifying targets before firing, making sure every shot was legal, justified, clean, until he'd started watching the German medic. The man had appeared in Nathan's scope on January 30th, working near a camouflaged artillery position that Nathan had been tasked with observing. Standard Wehrmacht medic uniform, white helmet with red cross, armband clearly visible. But something felt wrong. The medic never approached wounded soldiers, never carried medical supplies, never did anything that looked like actual medical work. Instead, he moved between artillery positions with a radio, occasionally speaking into it while scanning American lines. Nathan had reported this to his commanding officer, Captain Morrison. "Sir, I think that medic might be an artillery spotter. He's always near the guns, always with a radio, never treating wounded." Morrison had looked at him like he was insane. "He's wearing a Red Cross, Corporal. That makes him untouchable. I don't care what your gut tells you. We don't shoot medics. Ever. Understood?" "Yes, sir." But Nathan had kept watching, kept documenting, kept noting the correlation between when the medic used his radio and when German artillery suddenly found American positions with impossible accuracy. 3 days of observation. 3 days of watching Americans die from artillery strikes that seemed guided by someone with perfect intelligence about their positions. And now, at 14:27 hours on February 2nd, Nathan had just watched it happen again. The medic had spoken into his radio, and 30 seconds later, 88mm shells had landed directly on an American patrol that should have been invisible from German artillery positions. 8 men, maybe dead, maybe wounded, definitely hit by artillery that someone had called in with perfect coordinates. Nathan's finger had moved to the trigger before his brain finished processing the decision. This wasn't about following orders anymore. This was about stopping whoever was killing Americans from a position of protected status. If he was right, if that Red Cross was a disguise, then the man deserved to die. If he was wrong, Nathan would face a firing squad for murdering a medic. The shot broke the afternoon silence. 400 yards downrange, the German medic dropped like a puppet with cut strings. The Red Cross armband was still visible as he fell. Nathan Cross learned to hunt when he was 8 years old, following his father through Montana wilderness in pre-dawn darkness, watching how silence and patience mattered more than marksmanship. His father, Daniel Cross, guided elk hunters for wealthy clients from back east men who paid good money to shoot trophy animals they couldn't track themselves. Daniel would find the elk, position the client, and let them take credit for kills he'd orchestrated. It paid for Nathan's childhood. But Daniel's real lessons came during the off-season, when father and son hunted alone for meat that would fill their freezer through winter. "Never take a shot you're not certain of," Daniel would say, glassing distant ridgelines for elk movement. "If you're guessing, you're not ready. Wait until you know." Nathan learned to wait. Hours in frozen mountain positions, watching, reading terrain, understanding animal behavior. He learned that good hunters didn't rush. They observed patterns, predicted movement, then acted with absolute certainty. By 16, Nathan could track elk across 3 valleys and put a bullet through the heart at 400 yards. By 18, he'd never wounded an animal he couldn't find and finish cleanly. His father had taught him something else too. Ethics mattered. "Some hunters shoot anything that moves," Daniel said once, after they'd passed on a shot at a cow elk with a calf. "Those aren't hunters. Those are killers. A hunter respects what he's taking, respects the limits, respects the rules that keep it from becoming slaughter." Nathan had carried that lesson into the army. When sniper instructors at Fort Benning taught him to identify targets officers, machine gunners, radio operators, they'd also taught him who was off limits: medics, chaplains, wounded enemy attempting surrender. The Geneva Convention drew lines that civilized armies didn't cross. Nathan had understood instinctively. These were the rules that kept war from becoming pure slaughter. He'd been a good sniper because he'd been a good hunter, patient, disciplined, certain before shooting. In 4 months of combat across France and Belgium, Nathan had taken 43 confirmed kills. Every shot justified, every target legitimate. He'd never fired on instinct, never pulled the trigger without absolute certainty that the man in his scope deserved to die according to the rules both armies supposedly followed, until Hürtgen Forest broke him. The meat grinder didn't just consume lives, it consumed certainty. In dense forest where visibility ended at 50 yards, where German positions were invisible until they opened fire, where American patrols died from artillery that seemed omniscient, the rules started feeling like chains. Nathan watched men die from shell fire that shouldn't have found them, from positions that shouldn't have known they existed. Someone was feeding intelligence to German artillery, someone who could see American movements and communicate them in real time. When the medic appeared in his scope, Nathan's hunter instincts screamed wrong. Everything about the man's behavior contradicted his protected status. Real medics treated wounded. This one carried a radio. Real medics stayed away from combat positions. This one lived among artillery crews. Real medics didn't scan American lines with binoculars and speak into radios seconds before shells landed. But instinct wasn't proof. Suspicion wasn't certainty. And the Red Cross armband that man wore carried the weight of international law, centuries of military tradition, and the promise that some things remained sacred even in war. Shooting a medic wasn't combat. It was murder. It would make Nathan the same as the men who committed atrocities, who ignored rules, who turned war into slaughter. His father's voice echoed across years and distance. If you're guessing, you're not ready. But Nathan had been watching for 72 hours, had documented patterns, had correlated radio transmissions with artillery strikes, had seen 8 more Americans fall this morning from shells called in by someone with perfect intelligence. How much certainty was enough? How many Americans had to die before suspicion justified action? The shot had left Nathan's rifle before he'd fully answered those questions. The medic had dropped, and Nathan Cross, Montana elk hunter turned army sniper, had just crossed a line that 4 months of disciplined patience had taught him never to cross. He pulled back from his position immediately, gathering his rifle, moving through the forest with the practiced silence of a man who'd spent his youth stalking animals that could detect human presence from hundreds of yards away. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel righteous. He felt the same hollowness he'd felt the one time he'd wounded an elk as a teenager and taken 3 hours to track it down and finish the kill. The knowledge that he'd failed his own standards, that the hunt had become something ugly. Except this time, the target had been human, protected, and Nathan had no idea if he'd just saved American lives or committed the war crime that would destroy his own. Nathan had been watching the German medic for 72 hours, and in that time, the man had acquired a name in Nathan's mind. Ghost. Not because he was elusive, the opposite, actually. Ghost stayed visible, working openly near German artillery positions, confident in the protection his Red Cross armband provided. But he moved through the battlefield like a phantom, present but untouchable, killing Americans from a position no one could legally target. January 30th, 0820 hours. First sighting. Nathan had been assigned to observe German artillery positions camouflaged in a draw 300 yards east of American lines. Through his scope, he'd spotted the medic kneeling beside a wounded German soldier. Standard battlefield medicine. The wounded man was bleeding from a leg wound, and Ghost was... Nathan had paused. Ghost wasn't treating the wound. He was talking into a radio while the wounded soldier bled into the snow. 20 seconds of radio transmission, then Ghost stood and walked away, leaving the wounded man untreated. 30 seconds later, American mortars had landed 200 yards from Nathan's position, forcing his patrol to relocate. Close. Too close. Someone had called in their approximate position. Nathan had noted it in his field journal. Time, location, radio transmission followed by artillery, possibly coincidence. January 31st, 1340 hours. Ghost appeared again, this time near a different artillery position. Nathan watched him through the scope for 40 minutes. A wounded German soldier was carried past Ghost's position, clearly needing medical attention. Ghost ignored him completely. Instead, he spent the time scanning American lines with binoculars, occasionally speaking into his radio. No medical supplies visible. No aid station. No wounded being treated. Nathan documented this too. 2 days. No medical activity. Always near artillery. Always with radio. February 1st, 06:30 hours. American patrol moved through a sector that should have been safe from German observation-thick forest cover. No clear sightlines. Nathan watched Ghost raise his binoculars, scan the tree line where the patrol was hidden, then speak into his radio. 90 seconds later, German 88mm shells landed directly on the patrol's position. 3 men killed instantly, 5 wounded. The accuracy was impossible unless someone had provided exact coordinates. Nathan's hands had tightened on his rifle. This wasn't coincidence anymore. This was pattern. Ghost was directing German artillery from a position protected by international law, using a Red Cross armband as a shield to kill Americans with impunity. But pattern wasn't proof. Correlation wasn't evidence. Nathan couldn't see what Ghost was saying into that radio. Couldn't prove the transmissions were artillery coordinates, rather than legitimate medical communications. He'd reported it to Captain Morrison again. "Sir, I've been watching that medic for 3 days. He's not treating wounded. He's calling in artillery strikes." Morrison's patience had worn thin. "Corporal Cross, I don't care what you think you're seeing. That man is wearing a Red Cross. We don't shoot medics based on suspicion. If you take that shot without orders, you'll face a court-martial for murder. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir." "Then stop watching him and find legitimate targets." But Nathan couldn't stop. Ghost had become an obsession, a puzzle his hunter's mind needed to solve. He'd started documenting everything with the same precision his father had taught him to track elk. Time of observation, weather conditions, Ghost's exact position, radio transmissions, artillery strikes that followed. The correlation was undeniable. Every time Ghost used that radio near American positions, shells landed within 2 minutes. By February the 2nd, Nathan had filled 4 pages in his field journal with observations. Ghost had been near artillery positions for 12 separate occasions, had used his radio 11 times, had treated wounded soldiers 0 times, had carried medical supplies, never. The only medical equipment Nathan had seen was the Red Cross armband and white helmet that made him untouchable. At 14:05 hours on February the 2nd, Nathan had watched an American Patrol 2nd Platoon, Baker Company, men he'd eaten breakfast with that morning advance through a forest sector that German artillery shouldn't have been able to target. No direct observation, no clear sight lines. Safe. Ghost had appeared on a ridgeline 400 yards from Nathan's position. Binoculars up, radio out, scanning. Nathan had centered his crosshairs on the man's chest, finger resting beside the trigger guard. Not yet. Wait. Confirm. Ghost's lips moved, speaking into the radio. Nathan counted seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. The first shell landed among 2nd Platoon at 8 seconds, then 3 more in rapid succession, bracketing the patrol with the precision of someone providing real-time corrections. Men Nathan knew. Men who'd shared cigarettes and complained about the cold. Torn apart by artillery called in by a man wearing a Red Cross. Nathan's crosshairs had drifted to the armband. White fabric with Red Cross. Protected under Articles 24 through 26 of the Geneva Convention. Untouchable. Sacred. The symbol that said, "This man saves lives, he doesn't take them." But Ghost wasn't saving lives. He was ending them, and the rules that protected him were being used as a weapon more effective than any rifle. Nathan's finger moved to the trigger. His father's voice, "If you're guessing, You're not ready. But Nathan wasn't guessing anymore. He'd observed, documented, confirmed pattern. This wasn't instinct. This was certainty built from 72 hours of patient watching. The same certainty he'd felt before every clean elk kill in Montana mountains. Except shooting Ghost wouldn't be clean. It would be murder under military law, court-martial, firing squad, disgrace. His father's lessons turned into a war crime, unless Nathan was right, unless that Red Cross was a lie. The German shells were still falling on 2nd Platoon when Nathan squeezed the trigger. The bullet traveled 400 yards in less than half a second. Nathan watched through the scope as Ghost collapsed, the Red Cross armband still visible as he fell. No dramatic spin, no theatrical death, just the sudden transition from alive to not alive that Nathan had seen 43 times before, except this time felt different. This time felt like murder. Nathan didn't move from his position immediately. Standard sniper protocol: stay concealed after the shot. Watch for reaction. Confirm the kill. Through his scope, he saw German soldiers rushing to Ghost's position. They surrounded the body, shouting, confused. One soldier pointed toward American lines, scanning for the shooter. Another knelt beside Ghost, checking for pulse. The reaction told Nathan everything. They'd believed the Red Cross too. They'd thought Ghost was actually a medic. Or maybe Ghost was a medic, and Nathan had just committed the war crime that would end his life. American infantry moved forward 20 minutes later, advancing through the sector where 2nd Platoon had been shelled. The German artillery had gone silent. No more shells, no more perfect targeting. Whatever Ghost had been doing, he wasn't doing it anymore. Nathan watched Captain Morrison's unit reach the German position, watched them secure the area, watched MPs examine Ghost's body. Then Morrison's voice came over the radio, sharp and cold. "Corporal Cross, return to command post immediately." Nathan gathered his rifle and moved through the forest, each step carrying the weight of what he'd done. The walk took 15 minutes, long enough to rehearse explanations, long enough to accept that no explanation would matter. He'd shot a medic. The evidence was irrefutable. The armband had been visible in his scope. He'd known what he was shooting. Morrison waited at the command post with 2 military police officers. His face was granite. "Corporal Cross, you're under arrest for the willful killing of protected medical personnel. Surrender your weapon." Nathan handed over his Springfield rifle. "Sir, I need to explain." "You can explain at your court-martial." Morrison's voice carried disgust. "We found the body. German medic. Red Cross armband. White helmet. Clearly marked. You shot him anyway." "He wasn't treating wounded, sir. He was calling artillery." "Enough!" Morrison stepped closer. "Do you understand what you've done? You've given the Germans justification to shoot our medics. You've violated the Geneva Convention. You've made us no better than the SS." One of the MPs stepped forward with handcuffs. Nathan didn't resist. As they secured his wrists, Morrison added quietly, "We searched the body, found a radio. But every German medic carries radios for evacuation coordination. That doesn't make him a legitimate target." "Sir, if you check my field journal," "I checked it. 3 days of observations that prove nothing except you were obsessed with killing a medic." Morrison turned away. "Get him out of my sight." They walked Nathan to a temporary holding area, a reinforced cellar in a destroyed Belgian farmhouse. Through the doorway he heard soldiers talking. Their voices carried through the cold air. "Shot a medic in cold blood. What kind of monster shoots someone wearing a Red Cross?" "Sniper finally cracked. Hürtgen does that." Nathan sat on the stone floor, wrists still cuffed, replaying the shot in his mind. The crosshairs centered on the armband, the squeeze of the trigger, Ghost falling. He'd been so certain. 72 hours of observation, pattern recognition. the artillery correlation. Everything had pointed to Ghost being an artillery spotter using Red Cross protection as cover. But certainty based on observation wasn't the same as proof. And the Geneva Convention didn't have exceptions for, I was pretty sure he wasn't really a medic. The rules were absolute. Medics were protected. Nathan had violated those rules. That made him a war criminal. 6 hours later, Captain Morrison returned. His expression had changed, still angry, but confused now too. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. We sent the body to intelligence for processing. They identified him. Morrison paused. SS Hauptsturmführer Werner Steiner, artillery forward observer, known for operating in stolen medic uniforms. The Red Cross armband was fake, sewn poorly, wrong shade of red. His real uniform was underneath. Nathan's chest loosened. Then I was right. He was... You didn't know that when you pulled the trigger. Morrison's voice was flat. You shot a man wearing a Red Cross based on suspicion. The fact that your suspicion turned out to be correct doesn't change what you did. You killed someone you believed was a protected medic. That's murder, Corporal. The court-martial proceeds as scheduled. They left Nathan in the cellar with the knowledge that he'd been right, and it didn't matter. The court-martial convened on February 9th, 1945, in a requisitioned Belgian schoolhouse that still smelled of chalk and children. 3 officers sat behind a table, Major Phillips presiding, flanked by 2 captains Nathan had never met. They looked at him like he'd already been convicted. Maybe he had. The prosecution was led by Captain Anderson, a JAG officer who'd been handling military justice cases since Normandy. He stood before the court with Nathan's Springfield rifle as evidence. Gentlemen, the facts are simple. On February 2nd, Corporal Cross fired on and killed a clearly marked medical personnel. The victim wore a white helmet with Red Cross insignia and a Red Cross armband visible from 400 yards. Corporal Cross observed these markings through his rifle scope before pulling the trigger. This isn't combat. This is murder. Anderson presented testimony from Nathan's spotter, who confirmed Nathan had been tracking the medic for days, presented Nathan's field journal with its obsessive documentation, presented photographs of Ghost's body showing the Red Cross armband clearly visible. Then Anderson delivered his conclusion. Corporal Cross violated Article 24 of the Geneva Convention. He shot a protected medical worker in cold blood. The fact that post-mortem examination revealed the victim was an SS officer in disguise is irrelevant. Corporal Cross did not know this when he fired. He believed he was killing a medic, and he killed him anyway. Nathan's defense counsel was Lieutenant Parks, the same overworked JAG officer who'd defended deserters and thieves across the Ardennes. Parks stood with Nathan's field journal. Corporal Cross documented 72 hours of observation. He noted that the victim never treated wounded, always carried a radio near artillery positions, and consistently transmitted immediately before American casualties. He was conducting reconnaissance before acting. Major Phillips interrupted. Reconnaissance that concluded with shooting someone wearing a Red Cross? Reconnaissance that identified an enemy combatant using false medical insignia, which Corporal Cross could not have known for certain when he fired. Parks tried a different angle. The victim was later identified as SS Hauptsturmführer Werner Steiner, a known artillery spotter. Corporal Cross's suspicions were correct. Being correct after the fact doesn't justify the action, Phillips said. If we allow soldiers to shoot medics based on suspicion, the Geneva Convention becomes meaningless. Nathan was called to testify. He described the 72 hours of observation, the pattern of radio transmissions followed by artillery strikes, the complete absence of medical activity. He explained his certainty that Ghost was directing fire that killed Americans. But you couldn't prove it, Anderson said during cross-examination. You had no intercepted communications, no documents, just correlation and instinct. I had 72 hours of documented observation. You had suspicion, and you used that suspicion to justify murdering a man wearing a red cross. Anderson turned to the court. If we excuse this, we tell every soldier that the Geneva Convention is optional. That protected medical personnel can be shot whenever someone has a bad feeling. Corporal Cross may have guessed correctly about Steiner's identity, but he committed murder based on that guess. The law doesn't reward lucky war crimes. The court deliberated for 40 minutes. When they returned, Major Phillips read the verdict without emotion. Corporal Nathan Cross, this court finds you guilty of willful killing of protected medical personnel in violation of the Geneva Convention. You are hereby sentenced to 15 years confinement at Fort Leavenworth Military Prison and dishonorably discharged from the United States Army. Nathan stood silent. Parks tried to object, citing Steiner's SS identity as mitigating evidence. Phillips cut him off. The victim's actual identity, discovered after death, does not change Corporal Cross's intent at the moment of firing. He believed he was shooting a medic. That belief made his action criminal, regardless of whether the belief was mistaken. This court must uphold the Geneva Convention absolutely, or it protects no one. Military police led Nathan from the schoolhouse. Through the window he could see Hürtgen Forest stretching east toward Germany. Somewhere in those woods, American soldiers were advancing without German artillery, finding them with impossible accuracy. Ghost was dead. The targeting had stopped. Nathan had saved lives, and he'd spend the next 15 years in prison for it. Nathan Cross served 11 years at Fort Leavenworth before early release for good behavior in 1956. He returned to Montana at 35 years old with a dishonorable discharge that made him unemployable for anything requiring background checks. No hunting guide licenses, felons couldn't carry firearms, no government work, no teaching, just a criminal record that said he'd murdered a medic. He found work at a lumber mill in Kalispell, operating machinery that didn't care about his service record. He never married, never spoke about the war. When people asked about his limp acquired during a prison work detail accident, he said it was from a logging injury, easier than explaining Fort Leavenworth. His father had died in 1947 while Nathan was still imprisoned. They'd never reconciled. Daniel Cross had written one letter after the conviction. You violated everything I taught you about certainty before killing. You guessed, and guessing made you a murderer. Nathan never responded. What could he say? That 72 hours of observation was certainty? That pattern recognition justified breaking the Geneva Convention? His father wouldn't have accepted those excuses. Nathan barely accepted them himself. In 1975, a researcher at the U.S. Army Military History Institute discovered something in newly declassified German archives. SS Hauptsturmführer Werner Steiner had been a specialist in artillery coordination, specifically trained to operate in stolen medical uniforms. German records showed he'd directed fire that killed over 200 American soldiers across 3 months. He'd been commended by his SS commanders for innovative use of enemy humanitarian protocols as tactical advantage. The researcher, a graduate student named Coleman, traced Steiner's service record and found the connection to Nathan's court-martial. He wrote a detailed report recommending the conviction be overturned posthumously. Corporal Cross correctly identified an enemy combatant conducting illegal warfare under false medical protection. His action was justified. The Army reviewed Coleman's report in 1977 and declined to act. The court-martial was legally sound based on information available at the time. Corporal Cross shot a man he believed to be a protected medic. That his belief was incorrect does not change his culpable intent. The conviction stands. Nathan Cross died in 1978 at Kalispell Regional Hospital, 57 years old, from complications related to pneumoconiosis lung disease from decades of sawdust exposure at the mill. His obituary listed him as a lumber worker, No mention of military service. No mention that he'd saved American lives by violating the law designed to preserve humanity in war. His son, Michael Cross, discovered Coleman's research report in 1982 while researching family history. Michael had grown up knowing only that his father had been court-martialed, but never knowing why. The report revealed everything: the 72 hours of observation, Werner Steiner's SS identity, the 200 Americans who would have died if Nathan hadn't taken that shot. Michael petitioned the Army again in 1984 to overturn his father's conviction. Again, denied. The Army's position remained unchanged. Intent at the moment of action determines legality, not discoveries made after. If this story makes you question where the line falls between murder and necessary action, subscribe. Because the rules of war exist to preserve humanity, until following those rules costs more lives than breaking them. Nathan Cross killed one man wearing a Red Cross armband and spent 11 years in prison. Werner Steiner killed 200 men while wearing that same armband and was commended for it. History remembers Steiner as a war criminal who abused Geneva protections. History barely remembers Nathan at all. Sometimes being right isn't enough. Sometimes the law values the symbol more than the lives it's supposed to protect. And sometimes the man who breaks the rules to save his brothers dies knowing he did the right thing for all the wrong reasons. Nathan never fired his rifle again after February 2, 1945. But in Montana bars, in lumber mill break rooms, in the quiet moments before sleep, he saw Ghost falling with that Red Cross armband still visible, still protected, still sacred, still killing Americans until someone loved the men in his scope more than he feared breaking the law.